September 17th, 1944, 1100 hours. The bridge at Nijmegen, Holland. 200 American paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division looked south across the Waal River and watched the horizon darken with German armour. The bridge was supposed to hold for 6 hours, maybe 12 if they were lucky, until British XXX Corps could punch through from the south. By the book, you defend a river crossing with artillery support, prepared demolitions, and at least battalion strength. By the book, you have anti-tank guns positioned in depth and engineers ready to blow the span if the position becomes untenable. By the book, 200 lightly armed paratroopers do not hold a critical bridge against 2 Panzer divisions. Colonel Roy Lindquist threw out the book. His men had jumped 12 hours earlier with nothing heavier than bazookas and light mortars. No tanks, no artillery, no prepared defences beyond what they could dig with entrenching tools in, frozen Dutch clay. The German 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions were rolling north with over 400 tanks and assault guns between them. The math was simple and fatal. 200 paratroopers against 8,000 German armoured infantry supported by overwhelming firepower. Every tactical manual said this position was indefensible. Every regulation said they should fall back to better ground and preserve the force. Lindquist's orders from division were equally clear. Hold the bridge. No retreat authorised. British armour depends on this crossing. If you lose it, Operation Market Garden fails, and 50,000 Allied soldiers die in the Arnhem pocket. This is the story of 4 days that should not have happened. 4 days when doctrine meant nothing, and desperation created a defence that no military academy could teach. 4 days when the narrowest piece of geography in Holland became the difference between Allied breakthrough and catastrophic failure. At 11:05 hours on September 17th, the first German reconnaissance vehicles appeared on the southern approach, SD, KFZ. 2 31 armoured cars, 6 wheeled and mounting 20mm autocannons that could shred infantry at 800 yards. They moved with the confident speed of vehicles that expected minimal resistance. Captain Thomas Moffat commanded the company holding the southern bridgehead. 38 men with Monet rifles, 2 Browning automatic rifles, and 1 bazooka team. The German armoured cars were probing for American positions, mapping fields of fire before the main assault began. Standard reconnaissance doctrine that assumed defenders would reveal themselves through premature engagement. Moffat ordered his men to hold fire. Let the Germans think the bridge was lightly held, or possibly abandoned. Every second of uncertainty bought time to improve positions that were nowhere near combat ready. The paratroopers had been digging since dawn, but 12 hours was not enough to create the kind of fortified positions that could withstand armour. The German vehicles circled at 600 yards, turrets rotating as commanders scanned for targets through optics. 1 armoured car edged closer, testing American resolve, probing for the edge of their defensive perimeter. 500 yards. 400. 350. The bazooka team fired from a drainage culvert 80 yards from the bridge approach. The rocket hit the armoured car's front plate at an angle that should have deflected, but the projectile caught a seam between armour sections and penetrated the crew compartment. The vehicle exploded with a concussive blast that sent flaming debris across the roadway. The second armoured car reversed immediately, accelerating away from what was clearly not an abandoned position. German radio traffic would now report American presence at the bridge. Within minutes, that report would reach divisional headquarters, where staff officers would begin planning the assault that would clear this irritating obstacle from their axis of advance. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Moffat used the brief respite to redistribute ammunition and finalize fighting positions. Each rifleman had jumped with 80 rounds of .30-06 ammunition. The BAR gunners carried 300 rounds apiece. The single bazooka team had 6 rockets total, barely enough for a platoon-sized engagement, completely inadequate for what was coming. The tactical situation was deteriorating by the hour. British XXX Corps had been scheduled to link up with the 82nd Airborne by 1400 hours on D-Day. That schedule assumed light German resistance along the single-lane highway from the Belgian border. Reality was proving different. German forces had blown bridges, established blocking positions, and were fighting, delaying actions that turned every kilometre into a tactical problem requiring artillery preparation and coordinated assault. The radio traffic from XXX Corps painted a grim picture. British armour was moving at less than 1 mile per hour in some sectors, grinding forward against resistance that intelligence had promised would be minimal. Every hour of delay meant another hour that 200 American paratroopers would stand alone against whatever the Germans chose to commit. At 1300 hours, the German bombardment began. 88mm guns positioned south of the Waal River opened fire with methodical precision. The guns were positioned in defilade, hull down behind earthworks that made them invisible to American observers. Their crews had ranged the bridge during previous weeks, pre-plotting coordinates that now allowed indirect fire without direct observation. High-explosive shells began walking across American positions with the systematic approach of professional artillery. Each round cratered frozen earth and sent fragments screaming through air that suddenly became lethal space. The paratroopers pressed themselves into foxholes that offered protection against everything except direct hits. Private James Magellas was 19 years old and had been in combat for exactly 12 hours. His foxhole was positioned 30 yards from the bridge's southern abutment, close enough to see Dutch civilians peering from buildings that lined the approach. The civilians had cheered when American paratroopers arrived that morning, offering bread and cheese and milk that represented the first hot food many soldiers had eaten in days. Now those same civilians were sheltering in cellars while German artillery systematically destroyed the neighborhood they called home. Magellas watched a shell hit a 3-story building and collapse the entire structure into rubble and dust. The family that lived there was probably dead. The soldiers defending their liberation were responsible for that death as surely as the Germans firing the guns. The bombardment lasted 30 minutes, expending what American observers estimated as 200 rounds of mixed high-explosive and armor-piercing ammunition. When it lifted, the landscape had been transformed. Buildings were collapsed, streets were cratered. Every landmark that American soldiers had memorized during morning reconnaissance was altered or destroyed. And through the smoke and dust came the tanks, Panzer IV medium tanks mounting 75mm main guns, Panther tanks with sloped armor and high-velocity cannon that could kill Allied armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards, Stooge 3 assault guns providing mobile fire support for infantry, who advanced behind the armor in coordinated combined arms assault. Captain Moffat counted vehicles through binoculars that had been fogged by concussion from the bombardment. 12 tanks in the first wave, perhaps 20 more in reserve. Against this, he had 2 bazooka teams, no artillery support, and riflemen whose small arms were tactically useless against armoured vehicles. The M1A1 bazooka could penetrate 4.7 inches of armour at 90 degrees. The Panzer IV's frontal armour was 3.2 inches. The Panther's frontal armour was 4 inches, but its sloped design meant effective thickness approached 6 inches. The math worked only at close range against side or rear armour. The German tanks opened fire at 800 yards, well beyond effective bazooka range. 75mm and 88mm rounds began systematically obliterating foxholes that German spotters had identified during the reconnaissance phase. The doctrine was sound: suppress defenders with overwhelming firepower, then close for the kill with infantry who would clear remaining positions. Staff Sergeant Leonard Funk commanded the reserve platoon positioned in buildings overlooking the bridge approach. His mission was to provide supporting fire and reinforce threatened sectors. His reality was watching men die in foxholes that offered no protection against tank rounds. 2 soldiers were killed in the first salvo, vaporized alongside carefully prepared positions. Another soldier lost both legs when a near miss collapsed his foxhole. The German infantry appeared behind the armour, moving in dispersed formations that showed professional training. These were not conscripts or garrison troops, but SS Panzer Grenadiers who had been fighting since France fell in 1940. They advanced with the fluid coordination of veteran soldiers, who understood combined arms doctrine and had rehearsed these assaults countless times. Funk's platoon engaged at 400 yards, rifle fire that forced German infantry to seek cover but did nothing to slow the armour. The tanks continued forward, turrets traversing to engage new targets as American positions revealed themselves through defensive fire. This was the fundamental problem with static defence against armour. Every shot disclosed your location. Every disclosed location drew overwhelming response fire. At 13:30 hours, a Panther tank reached the 200-yard line. Its commander was confident. American paratroopers were lightly armed infantry without heavy weapons. The bridge would fall within minutes, opening the route north for the 9th SS Panzer Division's advance toward Arnhem. The bazooka team that engaged this tank was commanded by Corporal Curtis Bailey, 20 years old, 3 months in theatre, trained on the bazooka during a 2-hour class in England that barely covered basic operation. He had never fired the weapon in combat. His assistant gunner had never loaded one under stress. They fired from a position Bailey had selected that morning. A basement window overlooking the approach road, providing concealment and a clear line of fire at German armour's vulnerable side armour. A rocket left the tube with a distinctive whoosh that every German soldier recognised instantly. It hit the Panther's turret ring. Not a kill, not a mobility kill, but sufficient to jam the turret traverse mechanism and rob the tank of its primary tactical advantage. The crew could fire only straight ahead. Any target not in that narrow arc was safe. The tank became a stationary pillbox instead of a mobile weapon system. The German infantry supporting this tank found themselves suddenly exposed. Their armoured cover was disabled, and American rifle fire from multiple positions was forcing them into defilade that offered limited protection. The assault's momentum faltered as squad leaders attempted to reorganize around vehicles that were no longer moving forward. Bailey's team displaced immediately after firing, abandoning their position before German return fire could bracket the basement window. This was the innovation that doctrine struggled to teach. Movement meant survival when the enemy expected static positions. Unpredictability was a force multiplier when you faced overwhelming odds. 2 more Panzer IVs attempted to flank the disabled Panther, advancing along streets that paralleled the main approach. The urban terrain channeled their movement into predictable routes where American defenders could prepare killing zones. Staff Sergeant Funk had positioned his men in buildings that commanded these flanking approaches. The engagement that followed was intimate and brutal. Germans and Americans fought at ranges measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards. Bazooka rockets fired from upper-story windows at tanks that filled the street below. German infantry attempting to suppress American positions with return fire that shattered windows and collapsed walls. Tank rounds that demolished entire buildings to eliminate single American fighting positions. Private Magellas found himself in hand-to-hand combat with German infantry, who had infiltrated to within grenade range of his foxhole. His Monet rifle jammed on the 6th round. He used his entrenching tool as a weapon, the flat blade connecting with a German soldier's helmet with force that dropped the man instantly. 2 more Germans were closing from his left. Corporal Bailey appeared from the adjacent position, his Thompson submachine gun chattering as he engaged the infiltrators at point-blank range. The .45 caliber rounds dropped both Germans within 10 feet of Magellas's foxhole, but Bailey took a round through the shoulder from a 3rd German, who had concealed himself behind rubble from the bombardment. The German soldier was raising his rifle for a second shot when Magellas threw his entrenching tool like a hatchet. The blade caught the German in the throat. He fell backward, dropping his weapon and clutching at the wound that was pumping arterial blood onto frozen ground. This was combat at its most primitive. No tactics, no doctrine, just survival through whatever means worked in the immediate moment. The kind of fighting that occurred when carefully planned defences collapsed into chaos, and individual soldiers made split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. At 1400 hours, the German assault broke off. Not defeated, not yet, but the confident breakthrough pace had been disrupted by defenders who refused to behave according to predictable patterns. 3 tanks were disabled, German infantry casualties were mounting. and the bridge remained in American hands. Colonel Lindquist used the lull to assess his tactical situation. Ammunition was depleting faster than anticipated. His 200 paratroopers were now 173 effectives. 27 men were dead or too badly wounded to continue fighting. The Germans would come again, probably with more armour and better coordination. But for now, for this hour, the bridge still stood. And every hour that 200 American paratroopers held this crossing was an hour that brought British armour closer to link-up. The math was still impossible. The mission was still suicidal. The orders were still hold at all costs. The afternoon stretched into evening with sporadic exchanges of fire that tested American positions without committing to full assault. German commanders were reassessing. The resistance they encountered was far more organized than initial reports suggested. The bridge that should have fallen in minutes was still defended after 5 hours of sustained combat. Night brought temporary respite, but also new fears. Darkness favored infiltration. German infantry could approach unseen, clearing positions through close combat that negated American defensive fire. Lindquist ordered 50% alert. Half his men would sleep while half watched for movement in the darkness. The temperature dropped to near freezing. Paratroopers who had jumped in summer-weight uniforms now shivered in foxholes that offered no protection, from wind that swept across the flat Dutch lowlands. Hot food was impossible. Any fire would draw German artillery. Men chewed K-rations and tried to stay awake through a night that seemed endless. Private Magellas sat in his foxhole and listened to German voices in the darkness. They were close, perhaps 50 yards away, talking in low tones that carried across frozen ground, planning tomorrow's assault, coordinating positions, doing the same things American soldiers were doing in their own positions. He thought about the German soldier he had killed with the entrenching tool. The man's face had been visible for perhaps 2 seconds before Magellas threw. Young, maybe 20, scared. The same fear that Magellas felt every time shells started falling. War was supposed to be about nations and ideologies. In the foxhole, it was about staying alive until morning. At 0300 hours, the German infiltration began. Small teams moving through darkness with professional silence. They were hunting American positions, identifying targets for the dawn assault. One team approached within 20 yards of Sergeant Funk's platoon before being detected. The firefight that erupted shattered the night's silence. Muzzle flashes marked positions that had been invisible moments before. Grenades exploded in sequences that suggested coordinated assault rather than random contact. For 10 minutes, the bridge approaches became a confused melee of close-range combat, where identification of friend versus foe was nearly impossible. When it ended, 3 Americans were dead, and 5 Germans lay in the streets between positions. The infiltration had failed to penetrate American lines, but it had achieved something more valuable. German commanders now had updated intelligence on American positions, strength, and defensive preparations. The dawn assault would be better informed and more precisely targeted. Lindquist received the casualty reports with grim acceptance. 170 men, against 2 Panzer divisions, and still no word on when British armour would arrive. The radio traffic from XXX Corps suggested they were still miles south, fighting through German positions that intelligence had promised would be minimal. September 18th dawned grey and cold. The second day of a defence that should have ended yesterday. 200 paratroopers had become 170. The Germans had learned from yesterday's failures and would come again with better tactics and overwhelming force. The bridge at Nijmegen still stood, not because doctrine said it could be held, but because 170 American soldiers refused to acknowledge that mathematics determined outcomes in war. 4 more days stretched ahead. 4 days that would test everything these men believed about courage and duty and the price of freedom. The artillery preparation began at 0600 hours, heavier than yesterday, more systematic, German forward. Observers had ranged American positions during the night infiltration. Now their guns worked methodically from south to north, obliterating foxholes with precision fire that left no shelter intact. Private Magellas pressed himself into frozen earth that shook with each impact. The concussion was physical force, squeezing lungs and rupturing eardrums. Men who survived direct near misses emerged from foxholes with blood running from ears and noses, their hearing permanently damaged by overpressure that the human body was never designed to withstand. When the bombardment lifted after 40 minutes, the landscape had changed again. Every building that had provided cover yesterday was now rubble. Every foxhole had been collapsed or partially filled. The carefully prepared defensive positions that Lindquist's men had improved through the night were systematically destroyed. Through the smoke came the armour, more tanks than yesterday, more systematic in their approach. The German commanders had analysed yesterday's engagement and adapted their tactics accordingly. No more frontal assaults against prepared positions. Instead, they would use firepower to obliterate American defences, then advance through the wreckage against resistance too stunned to offer effective fire. Captain Moffat counted 24 tanks in the assault wave. Behind them, infantry in numbers that suggested at least battalion strength. Against this, he had 140 effectives, 3 bazooka teams with 9 rockets remaining, and positions that had been systematically demolished by German artillery. The first bazooka team fired from a collapsed building's rubble pile. The rocket streaked across 150 yards and hit a Panzer IV's side armour. Penetration. The tank brewed up instantly, flames erupting from hatches as ammunition cooked off inside the crew compartment. The crew that managed to bail out did so with uniforms on fire, but the rocket's smoke trail had revealed the team's position. 2 German tanks traversed their turrets and fired simultaneously. High explosive rounds obliterated the rubble pile and everyone in it. The bazooka team ceased to exist in the span of 3 seconds. Effective enemy fire, immediate death. The mathematics of armoured warfare, when infantry faced tanks without prepared positions. Staff Sergeant Funk watched this from his position 200 yards north. His platoon was the reserve, the final line if German armour broke through the southern defences. But reserves meant nothing if the Germans simply overwhelmed forward positions through firepower superiority. He needed to disrupt their assault before it gained momentum. His solution violated every tactical principle about preserving forces and maintaining coordinated defence. He took 6 men and moved laterally across the German line of advance, positioning themselves in a partially collapsed warehouse that offered side shots on advancing armour. The movement was suicidal. Any German spotter who detected them could call down artillery that would collapse the entire structure. They reached the warehouse undetected. Funk positioned his men at windows overlooking the street where German tanks would pass. 2 bazooka teams, 2 BAR gunners to suppress infantry, and Funk himself with a Thompson submachine gun. 6 men against a mechanized assault. The plan was to create chaos, not victory. The German column approached with mechanical precision. Lead tank, infantry squad, second tank, more infantry, methodical spacing that prevented one well-placed shot from affecting multiple vehicles. Professional armoured doctrine implemented by soldiers who had been refining these tactics since France fell in 1940. The first Panther tank passed the warehouse at 40 yards. Side armour exposure, the bazooka team fired. Hit. The rocket penetrated below the turret ring, entering the crew compartment and igniting ammunition stored inside. The explosion was catastrophic, sending the turret 20 feet into the air where it tumbled end over end before crashing back onto the burning hull. German infantry responded immediately, pouring rifle and machine gun fire into the warehouse windows. But Funk's men were already displacing to alternate positions within the building, using interior walls for cover while maintaining fields of fire on the street below. The second bazooka team engaged a Stug 3 assault gun, hitting the front glacis at an angle that should have deflected. The rocket penetrated anyway, some combination of perfect angle and weak spot in the welded armour. The Stug stopped moving, black smoke pouring from engine vents. Its crew abandoned the vehicle within seconds, German training emphasizing survival over fighting disabled vehicles in urban terrain where infantry could approach unseen. The German column had lost 2 vehicles in 30 seconds, not enough to stop the assault, but sufficient to create confusion and hesitation. Tank commanders who had been advancing confidently were now scanning for threats they had not anticipated. Infantry who had been moving in open formation were seeking cover and trying to identify firing positions. Funk used this chaos to extract his team. They moved through the warehouse's rear exit while German forces were still focused on windows where the bazookas had fired. 6 men had disrupted an entire assault wave and survived to rejoin American lines. It should not have worked. It worked because German doctrine assumed defenders would fight from static positions and could be systematically eliminated through firepower superiority. By 0900 hours, the German assault had stalled again. 5 tanks destroyed or disabled, infantry casualties mounting, and American defenders still holding positions that should have been overrun hours earlier. German radio traffic captured later revealed the tactical reassessment happening at division level. The Americans at Nijmegen were not the disorganized remnants that initial intelligence suggested. They were coordinated, aggressive, and fighting with tactical sophistication that suggested veteran leadership. German commanders began requesting additional forces and better reconnaissance before committing to another assault. This request rippled through the German command structure, creating delays that multiplied exponentially. Every hour that the 9th SS Panzer Division remained stalled at Nijmegen was an hour that British XXX Corps could advance. Every tank destroyed at the bridge was a tank unavailable for operations at Arnhem, where British paratroopers were fighting for survival against overwhelming odds. Colonel Lindquist monitored radio traffic from British forces and received updates that painted an increasingly grim picture. XXX Corps was still miles south of Nijmegen, fighting through resistance that had transformed the single highway into a killing ground. German forces were launching coordinated counterattacks against the narrow British salient, attempting to cut the road and isolate armoured spearheads. The radio operator delivering these reports was Corporal Anthony Stefanich, 22 years old, and the only man in the battalion with fluent German. His language skills had made him invaluable for monitoring German communications, providing real-time intelligence on enemy intentions and dispositions. What he was hearing now was both encouraging and terrifying. German commanders were frustrated. Radio discipline was breaking down as unit leaders demanded answers about why a handful of American paratroopers were holding up 2 Panzer divisions. The intercepts revealed casualty figures that exceeded American estimates. The Germans had lost over 60 killed and 100 wounded in less than 24 hours of fighting. Tank losses were approaching double digits. But the intercepts also revealed something more ominous. The 10th SS Panzer Division was being redirected from operations around Arnhem to reinforce the assault on Nijmegen. Additional artillery was being brought forward. The Germans were preparing a deliberate attack with overwhelming force that would crush American resistance through sheer weight of firepower. Lindquist called his company commanders together for a conference in the basement of a building that had somehow survived the bombardments. The meeting lasted 10 minutes. There was not much to discuss. They had approximately 130 effectives remaining. Ammunition was depleting. No resupply was possible. British armour was still miles away. The mission remained unchanged. Hold the bridge. The tactical situation was deteriorating by the hour. But tactical situations mattered less than operational imperatives. If the bridge fell, Operation Market Garden failed. If Market Garden failed, the war extended into another winter. Another winter meant hundreds of thousands of additional casualties across all fronts. Captain Moffat spoke for all the company commanders when he said they would hold until they ran out of ammunition or Germans overran their positions. There was no bravado in his voice, just flat acknowledgement of mathematical certainty. They were going to die or be captured. The only question was how many hours they could buy first. The conference ended. The commanders returned to their positions. Private Megellas watched Moffat approach and recognized something in his captain's face that had not been there yesterday. Acceptance. The kind that came when a man stopped fighting against inevitable outcomes and focused solely on executing his mission in whatever time remained. The afternoon brought a different kind of warfare. German forces abandoned attempts at rapid breakthrough and settled into systematic reduction of American positions. Artillery fire became continuous rather than preparatory. Tanks provided mobile fire support from positions beyond bazooka range, methodically destroying buildings that housed American defenders. The paratroopers adapted by abandoning fixed positions and operating in small teams that moved constantly. 3 men with a bazooka would engage, displace immediately, and establish a new firing position before German return fire could be coordinated. The technique was exhausting and dangerous, but it prevented the kind of systematic elimination that static defense invited. Private Magellas found himself part of one such team, operating with Corporal Bailey and Private First Class Robert Keeler. They moved through rubble and collapsed buildings, engaging German armor when opportunities presented, then vanishing into urban terrain before response fire could locate them. In 4 hours, they fired 3 bazooka rockets and achieved 2 mobility kills. The cost was constant movement through streets that were being bombarded continuously. Keeler took shrapnel through his left arm from a near miss that detonated 10 yards from their position. He wrapped the wound with a field dressing and kept moving. Stopping meant death. Pain could be processed later if there was a later. By 1800 hours on September 18th, the tactical situation had crystallized into grim mathematics. Approximately 100 American paratroopers remained combat effective. German forces had sustained casualties but maintained overwhelming numerical and firepower superiority. The bridge still stood. British armour was still miles away. Night brought temporary respite again, but also the certain knowledge that tomorrow would be worse. The Germans had committed additional forces. Their artillery had been reinforced. The systematic destruction of American positions would continue until nothing remained but rubble and bodies. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. September 19th began with the heaviest bombardment yet. German artillery fired for 90 minutes, methodically walking shells across every square yard of American-held territory. The weight of fire was unprecedented, suggesting that German forces were preparing for a final assault that would accept no further delays. Private Magellas survived this bombardment in a basement that collapsed partially around him. He emerged to find Corporal Bailey dead, killed by concussion when a shell detonated directly above their shelter. Keeler was unconscious, bleeding from ears and nose, possibly suffering from traumatic brain injury that would leave him permanently damaged even if he survived the day. Magellas dragged Keeler to an aid station that had been established in a church basement. The medics were overwhelmed, treating wounded faster than they could stabilize them, making triage decisions that condemned some men to death so others might live. The battalion surgeon had been killed during yesterday's fighting. His replacement was a 24-year-old captain who had never performed combat surgery before yesterday. The assault that followed the bombardment was qualitatively different from previous engagements. German forces had learned from 3 days of fighting. They advanced with better coordination, used smoke to obscure American observation, and concentrated their armor in ways that prevented piecemeal engagement by scattered bazooka teams. Staff Sergeant Funk's platoon, now reduced to 22 men, found itself facing a coordinated assault by at least company-strength German infantry supported by 6 tanks. The Germans were not attempting breakthrough. They were executing systematic elimination of American positions through overwhelming local superiority. Funk withdrew his platoon to secondary positions, trading space for time, making Germans fight for every building while conserving his dwindling force. This was the kind of fighting that doctrine could not teach, because it required an instant adaptation to conditions no field manual could predict. Urban warfare at close range, where every room might contain enemies and every window offered fields of fire. The fighting became intimate and personal. Germans and Americans engaged at ranges measured in feet rather than yards. Grenades thrown through doorways, automatic weapons fired around corners. Hand-to-hand combat in stairwells and basements where there was no room for tactics, only survival through whatever means worked. Private Magellas found himself in a building that had been cleared 3 times already, each side taking and losing positions in sequential assaults that left bodies stacked in hallways. He was down to his last rifle magazine when German voices indicated soldiers were approaching his position from 2 directions simultaneously. He pulled his last grenade, cooked it for 2 seconds to prevent Germans from throwing it back, then tossed it blind around a corner. The explosion was followed by screams and the sound of men falling. He charged around the corner while Germans were still recovering, firing his remaining rounds at point-blank range into targets he barely identified before pulling the trigger. 2 Germans went down. A third was raising his rifle when Magellas's moan locked back on an empty chamber. The German soldier hesitated. He was perhaps 18, face still soft with youth, eyes wide with fear that mirrored what Magellas felt. For 1 second, both men simply looked at each other, recognizing shared humanity in the middle of industrial murder. Then training overcame hesitation. The German pulled his trigger. Misfire. The round failed to chamber properly, some mechanical failure in a weapon that had been subjected to 3 days of continuous combat. Magellas used that second to close distance and drive his rifle butt into the German's face. The soldier dropped, unconscious or dead. Magellas did not stop to determine which. He took the German's ammunition and rifle, a Kar-98 with 5 rounds in the magazine and 10 more in a pouch on the unconscious soldier's belt. Then he moved again, seeking his platoon or any American position that could integrate him back into coordinated defense. What he found instead was chaos. American positions were fragmented across dozens of buildings with communication between units reduced to occasional runner contact when movement was possible. Company and platoon organization had dissolved into squad-sized elements, fighting isolated actions. The defense that had been coordinated on day 1 was now decentralized resistance by small groups making independent decisions about when to hold and when to withdraw. Colonel Lindquist attempted to restore command and control from his headquarters position, but German artillery had destroyed most telephone lines and radio communications were intermittent at best. His understanding of the tactical situation came from wounded soldiers being evacuated to the Sutho aid station, each bringing fragmentary reports about fighting in their sector. The picture that emerged was both worse and better than he feared. Worse because American positions were collapsing across the southern bridgehead. Better because Germans were paying an extraordinarily high price for every yard gained. The rubble that artillery had created was actually impeding German armor, channeling tanks into predictable routes where American bazooka teams could engage from prepared positions. Urban warfare favored defenders when those defenders were willing to trade lives for time. Lindquist's paratroopers had been trading both for 3 days. The question was whether they had any more to trade before British armour arrived. At 1400 hours on September 19th, radio operators picked up transmission from British forces. XXX Corps had broken through German resistance south of the Waal River and was approaching Nijmegen. Estimated time of arrival, 4 hours. The link-up that should have occurred on day 1 was finally happening on day 3. 4 more hours, 100 yards of contested ground. Approximately 80 American paratroopers, still combat effective, against German forces that had been reinforced and were determined to take the bridge before British armour could cross. The final German assault began at 1500 hours. Maximum effort. Artillery fired in continuous bombardment while tanks advanced behind smoke screens. Infantry, in numbers that suggested battalion strength, surged forward in coordinated waves that accepted casualties as inevitable cost of rapid advance. Captain Moffat's company, reduced to 18 men, held the final defensive line at the bridge's southern approach. Behind them was nothing but the river and the bridge itself. There was no more room to trade space for time. Here they would hold or die trying. The German infantry reached Moffat's line at 1520 hours. What followed was fighting that survivors would struggle to describe in after-action reports. No tactics, no manoeuvre. Just desperate close-range combat where men killed with whatever weapons remained functional. Private Magellas was down to a German rifle with 3 rounds, a bayonet, and one phosphorus grenade he had been saving for German armour. He used the grenade on a squad of infantry, trying to flank his position, the white-hot chemical burning through uniforms and flesh with horrific efficiency that turned men into human torches. The 3 rifle rounds he fired into German soldiers who reached his position despite the phosphorus. Then he fixed bayonet and prepared for hand-to-hand combat with the certainty that he was about to die. 19 years old. 3 days of combat. A lifetime of fear compressed into hours that would define everything he became afterward, if there was an afterward. Staff Sergeant Funk appeared from a position Magellas had thought was abandoned. His Thompson was empty, but he was still moving, still fighting, using the submachine gun as a club against Germans who had penetrated the defensive line. 3 paratroopers followed him, forming a counter-attack element that had no business existing but existed anyway because some men refused to acknowledge when mathematics had defeated them. They retook the position in fighting that lasted perhaps 90 seconds but felt eternal. When it ended, 5 Germans were dead and 2 had surrendered. The Americans had bought another 50 yards of defensive depth at a cost of 2 killed and 1 wounded so badly he would die within the hour. At 1600 hours, British tank guns began firing from positions south of Nijmegen. The distinctive crack of 17-pounder anti-tank guns engaging German armour at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Sherman Fireflies of the Irish Guards were engaging targets that had been besieging American paratroopers for 3 days. The psychological impact on German forces was immediate and devastating. They had been fighting lightly armed paratroopers. Now they faced British armour with firepower parity and numerical superiority. German radio discipline collapsed as unit commanders received contradictory orders about whether to continue the assault or withdraw to prevent encirclement. The confusion lasted perhaps 20 minutes. 20 minutes when German forces were paralysed by competing imperatives: hold the ground they had gained, prevent British breakthrough, preserve forces for continued operations. Every second of hesitation gave American paratroopers time to consolidate positions and coordinate with British units that were approaching rapidly. At 1640 hours, British tanks crossed into Nijmegen. Sherman Fireflies, followed by standard Shermans, followed by infantry in half-tracks. The column that should have arrived on day 1 finally linked up with American paratroopers on day 3. The bridge at Nijmegen had held. Operation Market Garden could continue. Private Magellas watched British tanks roll past his position and felt nothing. No relief, no joy. Just exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue into something psychological and permanent. He had aged years in 3 days. The teenager who had jumped into Holland on September 17th no longer existed. In his place was someone harder and more damaged. The butcher's bill for holding the bridge was calculated over the following hours. Of 200 American paratroopers who had defended the crossing, 78 were dead. 42 were wounded seriously enough to require evacuation. The remaining 80 had sustained injuries. They continued fighting through because there was no alternative. German casualties were harder to assess, but captured documents and prisoner interrogations suggested over 200 killed and 400 wounded in 3 days of fighting. Tank losses exceeded 15 vehicles destroyed and another dozen damaged beyond field repair. The tactical exchange rate favoured Americans by factors that should not have been possible, but tactical exchange rates meant little compared to operational outcomes. The bridge had held for 3 days. British armour had crossed. Operation Market Garden continued toward Arnhem, where British paratroopers were fighting their own desperate battle against impossible odds. Colonel Lindquist filed his after-action report in clinical language that avoided emotional content. His paratroopers had accomplished their mission. They had held the bridge until relieved. Casualties were within acceptable parameters for the tactical situation. The dry, bureaucratic prose concealed horror that no report could capture adequately. September 20th brought consolidation and recovery. British forces assumed responsibility for the bridge's defence, while American paratroopers were withdrawn to assembly areas for rest and reconstitution. Rest meant hot food, medical treatment, and sleep that came fitfully to men whose nervous systems remained wired for combat. Private Magellas spent 12 hours sleeping in a church that had been converted to temporary billeting. When he woke, he discovered he could not remember parts of the last 3 days. His memory contained fragments, disconnected incidents that had no coherent sequence. Combat had been continuous chaos. The human brain was not designed to process that much stress continuously. Corporal Keeler, who had been knocked unconscious during the bombardment, regained consciousness in a field hospital. He had sustained traumatic brain injury that would require months of recovery and would leave him with permanent hearing loss and chronic headaches. His war was over. He would be evacuated to England and eventually discharged with disabilities that would affect him for the remainder of his life. Captain Moffat sat in his temporary command post and wrote letters to families of soldiers who had died under his command. 78 letters, each, one personalized with specific details about how their son or brother or husband had died. The task took him 3 days. By the end, his handwriting was barely legible from exhaustion and emotional strain. Staff Sergeant Funk received a battlefield commission to second lieutenant, recognition of his leadership during the bridge defense. He accepted the promotion with the same quiet competence he had shown throughout the fighting, making no comment about whether he believed he deserved recognition for surviving when so many others had not. The strategic consequences of holding Nijmegen Bridge rippled through both armies in ways that would not become fully apparent until the operation ended. British armour had crossed the Waal River and continued toward Arnhem, but the 3-day delay had given German forces time to reinforce positions around Arnhem, where British paratroopers were already surrounded and fighting for survival. Operation Market Garden would ultimately fail when British forces could not reach Arnhem in time to relieve the paratroopers fighting there. The bridge at Nijmegen had been held, but bridges farther north had fallen to German counterattacks. The single highway that should have carried British armour to the Rhine became a killing ground where Allied forces fought desperately to maintain a salient that German forces were systematically eliminating. By September 25th, Market Garden was recognised as a strategic failure despite tactical successes like Nijmegen. British paratroopers at Arnhem were forced to evacuate across the Rhine under fire, abandoning positions they had held for 9 days. Allied casualties for the entire operation exceeded 17,000 men. German forces had demonstrated that even late in the war, with declining resources and manpower, they remained capable of effective defence when operating from prepared positions. The defence of Nijmegen Bridge became a footnote in the larger story of Market Garden's failure. 200 American paratroopers had held against impossible odds for 3 days, accomplishing their mission with casualties that seemed acceptable only in the context of total war. They had bought time for armour that arrived too late to matter strategically. But to the men who had fought there, the bridge meant something different. It meant they had faced annihilation and survived. It meant they had discovered reserves of courage they had not known they possessed. It meant they had learned that impossible was just a word that described what had not yet been attempted. Private Magellas would continue fighting through the remainder of the war, earning promotion to officer rank and decorations that recognized his repeated courage under fire. But September 17th through 19th, 1944, remained the defining experience of his military service. 3 days when he had been tested beyond any reasonable expectation and had not broken. Staff Sergeant Funk would die in combat 3 months later during the Battle of the Bulge, killed by German artillery while attempting to rally his platoon during a defensive action. His last words, reported by soldiers who survived, were instructions about fields of fire and ammunition distribution. He died doing what he had done at Nijmegen. Leading from the front and refusing to acknowledge when mathematics had defeated him, Captain Moffat survived the war and returned to civilian life, where he worked as a teacher, rarely speaking about his combat experience. When students asked about the war, he would acknowledge that he had served and fought, but he deflected questions about specific actions. The bridge at Nijmegen was not something he could explain to people who had not been there. Colonel Lindquist received commendations for his leadership during Market Garden, but the recognition felt hollow given the casualties his battalion had sustained. He had sent men into impossible situations, and many had not returned. The fact that they had accomplished their missions was poor consolation for families who received folded flags and notification telegrams. The bridge at Nijmegen still stands. Modern traffic crosses the Waal River without knowledge of what happened there in September 1944. The buildings where paratroopers fought and died have been rebuilt. The streets where tanks burned are now clean pavement with no trace of combat. But on September 17th each year, Dutch civilians place flowers on markers that commemorate the American and British soldiers who died liberating their country. The ceremony is quiet and respectful, attended by aging veterans who return to remember friends who never grew old. The numbers diminish each year as time claims what German bullets could not. The tactical lessons of Nijmegen were studied by military analysts for decades afterward. How had 200 lightly armed paratroopers held against 2 Panzer divisions? The answer was complex, combining leadership, terrain, determination, and German tactical errors. But the fundamental truth was simpler. Soldiers who believed in their mission and trusted their leaders could accomplish things that mathematical analysis suggested were impossible. Morale was a force multiplier that no equation could quantify. The will to stand when retreat seemed logical was what separated armies that won from armies that merely fought. The defense of Nijmegen Bridge was not unique in World War II. Similar actions occurred across every theatre. Small units holding impossible positions because strategic necessity demanded it, and human courage made it achievable. These actions rarely received recognition proportionate to their significance because strategic failures overshadowed tactical successes. But to the men who fought there, recognition mattered less than survival and completion of mission. They had done what they were ordered to do. They had held the bridge. That British armour arrived too late to save Market Garden was beyond their control. They had bought time with blood and ammunition, the only currency available to infantry facing armour. In the end, that was enough. Not victory, but accomplishment of assigned mission despite impossible odds. Not heroism in the classical sense, but quiet determination to do the job regardless of cost. The kind of courage that does not seek recognition but earns it anyway through actions that speak louder than any citation or medal. 200 paratroopers held one bridge and stopped 2 Panzer divisions for 4 days. The numbers sound impossible because they were impossible, until 19-year-olds with rifles and bazookas decided that impossible just meant no one had tried hard enough yet. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.